Well, this is a very special evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Asquith Forum entitled Educational Research in the 21st Century, Connecting the Scholar to the Classroom. As Sarah mentioned, this forum is just one of the many events that the Ed School has planned this year to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Harvard Educational Review. The Ed Review was founded in 1930 as a scholarly journal of opinion and research in education. Among education journals, HER is unique. Since 1945, the editorial board has consisted of doctoral students who are responsible for all editorial decisions. The student board works together to publish provocative pieces on a wide range of topics from a number of disciplines. The Harvard Ed Review's 75th anniversary has given us the opportunity to assess education research, past and future. How has education research evolved over the past 75 years? How are researchers addressing changing demands of the field involving technology and globalization, as well as increased pressure to link education theory, practice, and policy? And in what ways can established education institution maintain standards of excellence, tradition, and continuity while also being responsive and forward-minded? To start us off, I would like to address what I see as an emerging tension in the field about what constitutes education research. This tension concerns how educators define evidence-based research, and the tension is evident in two Washington initiatives. The first is a National Research Council study published in 2002 entitled Scientific Research in Education. The goal of this work was, and I quote, to examine and clarify the nature of scientific inquiry in education and how the federal government can best foster and support it. The committee found that at its core, scientific inquiry is the same across all fields, including education, and that it is a continual process of rigorous reasoning supported by a dynamic interplay among methods, theories, and finding. Scientific inquiry builds understandings in the form of models or theories that can be tested, and advances in scientific knowledge are achieved by the self-regulating norms of the scientific community over time. The committee determined that this kind of scientific enterprise depended on a healthy community of researchers and had to be guided by a set of fundamental principles enforced by the community of researchers that shape it. The second initiative is the adoption of the 2002 Education Sciences Reform Act and the subsequent creation of the Institute on Education Sciences, or IES. In 2005, the Department of Education finalized priorities for IES, which clearly indicate that the federal government will be supporting research, conducting evaluations, and compiling statistics in education that conform to, quote, rigorous scientific standards, and that they will be seeking to expand their capacity to develop and refine research methods, expand the use of longitudinal databases, and conduct systematic reviews of evidence. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that IES recently provided seed funding for a new professional organization based at Cornell, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. The mission of this new organization is to advance and disseminate research on the causal effects of education intervention practices, programs, and policies. It's become clear to me, as I'm sure to all of you, that through this move, IES has a narrower view of what constitutes education research than I suspect most of us would. And I suspect this afternoon's panelists will reflect on this tension as well as others in our field. They will also consider how the field can better develop researchers who are ready to meet the challenges of the next 75 years. At the core of our discussion will be the need to link research with practice, that is, the scholar with the classroom. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's panelists. I am going to introduce them sequentially, and then it is my job to moderate tonight's event. Each panelist has 12 minutes to talk. After 10 minutes, I'm going to say 2-minute warning into this microphone right here, and then after another 2 minutes, we'll stop. And I'm going to try to be a hard taskmaster so that we have time for discussion. I can see that we have microphones here, so as soon as the panelists have completed their presentations, feel free to jump into this discussion. To my left is Dr. Sonia Nieto from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is professor of education, and her research focuses on multicultural education, teacher education, the education of Latinos, immigrants, and other students of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She serves on several national advisory boards that focus on educational equity and social justice, and she has received many academic and community awards for her advocacy and activism. Her books include Affirming Diversity, the Socio-Political Context of Multicultural Education, which was published in 2004, as well as Why We Teach, which was published in 2005. Dr. Richard Murnane is the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His work focuses on the relation between education and the economy, teacher labor markets, the determinants of children's achievement, and strategies for making schools more effective. He has recently published an important book on how to connect research and data with schools and school decisions. The book is entitled Data-Wise, a step-by-step guide to using assessment results to improve teaching and learning. Dr. Kevin Kumashiro is a former teacher and teacher educator. He's the founding director of the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education and is senior program specialist in human rights and civil rights at the National Education Association. He is the author of several books on anti-oppressive education, including Troubling Education, published in 2002, for which he received the Myers Outstanding Book Award, and most recently, Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice, published in 2004. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panelists. And now I'm going to invite Dr. Nieto to speak for 12 minutes.
Okay. Okay, this doesn't count, though. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As everybody knows who knows me, I can't hug anybody today, and I can't shake anybody's hand, so please forgive me for that. But I have a bad cold, and I don't want to be the source of anybody else getting sick. I want to thank especially Ben and Sarah and Sean for facilitating my visit today, and the other organizers of the panel as well, and for giving me the opportunity to respond to these important questions. I really relish the opportunity because I've just retired from the University of Massachusetts after 25 years, and I've been in higher ed for 30 years, and before that, another half dozen at elementary and secondary schools. I've seen many changes in higher education, educational research over the past century. Let's see if I can get this up. And these include the continuing disconnect between research and practice, growing influence of grant making on research agendas, and a growing marketization of education at both K-12 and higher education. So in my remarks today, I want to focus on all of these because I can't really separate one from the other. When I began teaching at UMass more than 25 years ago, the pressure on faculty was to teach well and to publish, although even then the focus was much more on publishing. The changes in expectations for new faculty today have been spectacular, I think. Teaching, which was never the first priority at research institutions anyway, has taken a decidedly backseat to research. But even more dramatic, I think that research has nearly been replaced by grant making as a major responsibility and expectation, or at least it's seen as a prerequisite for undertaking research. That is, bring in the money so that you can do the research that you want to do. There are few institutions of higher education where new assistant professors aren't bombarded with the need to, quote, bring in the money for their research projects, and the sooner the better. So the problem with this, I think, is that the research agendas of new faculty members are increasingly being influenced, if not determined, by the funds that are out there to be gotten. In these increasingly conservative times, this is a major problem for those of us concerned with equity and social justice in education. matters that in spite of how they may be framed, and No Child Left Behind is a wonderful example of how it's framed in terms of social justice, but to me they're not at all at the forefront of social justice is not at the forefront of the conservative agenda. So as a result, the excessive influence of outside monies is particularly troublesome because educational movements and research in the service of equity are ephemeral and unpredictable, and they may be in vogue one year, out of vogue the next. They may be safe to study one year, and then they become dangerous. So an example is the article that I happened to write for the 75th anniversary issue, which is called High Hopes, Broken Promises, and an Uncertain Future, in which I looked at three educational movements that were popular for a time and then disappeared, or at least have been so contentious that it's been difficult to find funding for them. One is the field of desegregation. It was, for a time, a virtual cottage industry of research in the 60s and 70s that then disappeared. Of course, a notable exception is the work of Gary Orfield and his colleagues here at Harvard. But even then, it's not so much about the outcomes or the benefits of desegregation as much as it is about its disappearance. Secondly, the changing landscape of bilingual education, from actively promoted to scapegoated and then eliminated. In 1971, Massachusetts became the first state in the nation to require bilingual education for children whose native language is other than English. And in 2003, through a voter initiative, Question 2, it became the third state after California and Arizona to eliminate it. And paradoxically, Arizona and California are two of the states with the largest communities of speakers of languages other than English. In fact, it's now almost politically incorrect to even utter the term bilingual, which has in the past several years been replaced by ELL, or ELLs, English language learners, as if the entire identities of these students rested on their learning English. Even in the many states that haven't eliminated bilingual education, subtle and not so subtle changes are taking place that make it clear that bilingual education is no longer in vogue. In New York City, for instance, the Office of Bilingual Education, where my sister worked, was renamed the Office of English Language Learners. And then third, the controversies associated with multicultural education. Emerging from the civil rights movement, the push for multicultural education focused specifically on the shameful condition of education for African Americans and other children of color. That is what's now referred to as the achievement gap, which I prefer to call the resource gap or the expectations gap. But the idea that the histories and languages and cultural practices of non-mainstream students should be a central part of the standard curriculum has always been a hard sell. And movements against bilingual education, multicultural education rather, have ranged from the back to basics theme to the more recent pressure to teach to the test. So it's hard to believe that foundations and the federal government especially, or other institutions, will come to the rescue of social justice and equity research agendas by providing tons of money for professors to do research in these areas. So absent that, we're left with millions of dollars for research to develop tests for No Child Left Behind, with millions of dollars for research on ELLs, but virtually nothing for bilingual education, and millions for teaching phonics, but little for developing curriculum that promotes diversity and inclusion. So the important question for the panel is, in what ways can established institutions such as the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Harvard Ed Review maintain standards of excellence, tradition, and continuity while also being responsive and forward-minded? The Harvard Ed Review, I think, has a fine tradition of doing all of these and in being in the forefront of questions of equity and social justice. I recall that when I read the article Strategies for Failure by Annie Stein in the Harvard Ed Review in 1971, I was a teacher at the time. It was the first article that I had ever read that addressed issues of equity and social justice directly, and I was stunned and thrilled when I read it. Although I have to mention that Harvard Ed Review also published Arthur Jensen's infamous article, How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement, which was widely cited by the right, and it still is, as a rationale for the genetic inferiority of African Americans. But Harvard Ed Review also published in 1998 the first entire translation of an issue into Spanish that concerned the education of Puerto Ricans, and I was glad to be a part of that. So the HER record on addressing issues of race, social class, heterosexism, and other oppressive attitudes and behaviors, or racism rather, classism, heterosexism, and other oppressive attitudes and behaviors has been in the vanguard, and I think it needs to continue because the topics and issues being promoted by big money and the federal government are not these issues. In terms of schools of education, given the times in which we're living, it's both a courageous stand and a necessary step for schools and colleges of education, including the Harvard Graduate School of Education, to define themselves as fundamentally concerned with anti-racism, social justice, etc., and to act accordingly. So as we all know, schools and colleges of education are under attack as irrelevant and incompetent, and we need to fight back. One way to provide support, financial and moral. Oh, I think I should have probably, yeah. Okay, there's the Harvard Ed Review. And schools of education, sorry, I got away from myself. 2 minutes. I'll leave this as the final picture because I love this picture. It just represents so many of the kids who we teach today. So we know that schools and colleges are under attack as irrelevant and incompetent, and we need to fight back. So one way to provide support, both financial and moral, for professors doing research that goes against the grain, that goes against the grain of the conservative agenda, whether it's through institutions themselves or by seeking alternate funds. And so I think schools of education can do that. And another is to consider the kinds of programs we offer in schools of education. And I will end with this, that schools and that courses are often accused of being soft or unscientific by today's rigid standards that you mentioned of research if they consider the issues of social justice, and they're ridiculed if they address multiculturalism, which is often derided as politically correct jargon. Yet I suggest that matters of social justice are neither soft nor unscientific, but instead must be the very core of our teacher education programs. In a recent newspaper editorial in which he asks the question, schools of re-education? Frederick Hess, the director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a decidedly right-wing think tank, wrote about what he considers a troubling tendency among schools of education in the United States to, quote, regulate the dispositions and beliefs of those who would teach in our nation's classrooms, end quote. In other words, he suggests that schools and colleges of education need to focus on content and content only, never mind pedagogy, as if content were always neutral. Such criticisms, often posed as objective arguments by the right, are used to hide a fundamentally political argument against anything that smells of liberal or progressive ideas. So cloaking himself in the garb of political neutrality, Hess argues that, quote, screening the dispositions serves primarily to cloak academia's biases in the garb of professional necessity, end quote. So what should be the response of Harvard and other schools of education to such charges? Rather than shrink from these criticisms, I believe we need to fully embrace an agenda that promotes preparing teachers to work effectively with a diverse population of students, that encourages teachers to respect students' identities and their family strengths, and that promotes more meaningful interactions between scholars and teachers, so that the research we do in higher education has more relevance for the lives of real teachers and real children in real schools. Thank you very much.
And don't start my 12 minutes until I get my PowerPoint ready to go here.
I think they know me too well.
Okay. I was asked to talk about how research in the area that I know about as connected to education research has changed, and I'm an economist, that's what I know about, so hence the title. Now, when I stopped to think about this, it seemed to me that there are some really enduring questions that have interested economists way before even the 1960s. Even go back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, you'll see those same questions posed. So what can people with more education do better than people with less education? In virtually all societies for which we have data, we know that on average people with more education get paid more in the labor market than people who have less. But why? If you really stop and think about that, the answer is really not obvious, and it's a really an interesting question. Also, when you look and see, the payoff to education varies from, it varies from decade to decade within countries. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. It also varies across countries. Why is that? I mean, we're all kind of aware of these kind of facts probably, but why is that? What kinds of knowledge and skills best serve individuals and societies? Those, of course, are questions educators ask, and those really we need to answer to think about how do we make education better. And then, of course, this question of how do we organize education? Public schools, private schools, a mix? So those are kind of enduring questions. Now, if you look at work on this in the 1960s, my favorite book from the 1960s is Ted Schultz, Transforming Traditional Agriculture. And basically Schultz is asking, why is it that in some traditional societies, in some agricultural societies, education doesn't have much of a payoff, and agriculture doesn't change? And Schultz says it's not that people are hidebound and are willing to change, it's that the incentives are wrong. Basically, agriculture prices are kept low by government, and it's impossible for farmers to borrow money. Well, why is it that in other societies you see education having a high payoff that are highly agricultural? And Schultz's answer is those are societies in which green revolution techniques are coming into being, and when agricultural methods are changing, passing on an oral tradition of parent to child doesn't work as well. Knowing how to read makes a big difference. So those are kind of insights from a really very interesting book that has no math in it. It's very thin. And it's really the work of Schultz and his colleagues at the University of Chicago that created the economics of education as a distinct subfield in labor economics. So after the kind of bright beginning in the 1960s, you had the 1970s. The payoff to education became very low. 25 to 34-year-old college graduates were only earning 15% more than 25 to 34-year-old high school graduates after they had borrowed all that money and had gone to college for 4 years. Why is that? Well, Harvard economist Richard Freeman wrote a book that really made his reputation, The Overeducated American. Answer was simple. We had too many college graduates. All the baby boomers went to college, they graduated, they hit the labor market in the 1970s. Well, one consequence of this was it was tough for college graduates. It also was very tough for the economics of education. It really was a very fallow field. This is the decade in which I started, and you really could count most of the people who did, economists who did this work seriously, probably 2 hands were enough, but surely 2 hands and 2 feet were enough in this country. 1980s, real quite dramatic changes, big changes in the labor market for Americans. Real wages, net of inflation of high school graduates declined by 10%. Enormous growth in earnings inequality. And that led to a lot of interest. You know, does education have anything to do with that? Now, when you go and look at, well, what happened to educational attainments? I realize that's a bit hard to see. There's males on the left and females on the right. But basically, the 2 lines that go down are the percentage of adults who have only a high school education. That's the top one. And are only dropouts. That's the bottom one. Well, simply by those, we've got fewer high school graduates and fewer dropouts. You might say, gee, if they're becoming more scarce, their wages should maybe have gone up rather than down. But that's not what happened, of course. The bottom line are the real wages, net of inflation of dropouts. The pink line are college graduates. So something else had to have happened because the supply went just the other way. We had more college graduates. You might have expected that would push their wages down, but that's not what happened. Their wages went up. You had fewer high school graduates and dropouts as a percentage of labor force. You might expect that would have pushed their wages up. They went down. Well, why is that? Well, that's the subject of lots of work for lots of economists doing economics of education. And of course, it wasn't only economists who were interested in this. We know in 1983, A Nation at Risk was published. I know of at least 15 people who have argued they were the authors of that particular thin volume, and particularly the line about the rising tide of mediocrity. But in any case, it really marked a change from prior work had focused primarily on how much education people got, comparing earnings of high school graduates to college. A nation at risk really, with this clarion call, we need to worry about quality of K-12 education. Now, of course, that's much harder to actually measure than how many years people got. Then also, well, what do we do to improve quality? Well, by the mid to end of the 1980s, most analysts had become very discouraged the idea we just provide more money. As a result of school finance reform, starting with Serrano in California, late 1960s, per pupil expenditure in education had increased quite dramatically over the 70s and 1980s. But test scores really didn't change very much. So just providing more money didn't seem to be enough to be sure we got better schools. So, well, that led to the 1990s. Well, if it's not simply more money, what else should we do? Well, we need some changes in the way we deliver education. Well, here, of course, analysts had very different ideas about what they ought to do. Charter schools were the answers for some people. The first charter schools in the United States in 1992, the number grew dramatically over the next 15 years. Standards-based education. 49 of the 50 states now have standard-based education. The majority of them have exit exams. Unless you pass exams, you don't graduate from high school. A number, starting with Milwaukee, a number of cities instituted programs under which low-income families were given vouchers to attend private schools. Many new questions. Do vouchers make any difference? Do kids who go to charter schools learn more? Do charter schools have any impact on public schools? Standards-based education. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Well, lots of new questions, and the economics of education really became a remarkable growth industry. The number of economists doing good, serious work in this, while only perhaps a very small number 20 years ago, are really in the hundreds now. The last decade. Here you really see a number of new emphases. First of all, for lots of work, remember one of the prior graphs I showed you was the education distribution of the American labor force. Well, American firms now can get a lot of work done without using American workers. For many kinds of work, there really is a worldwide labor force. That really complicates thinking about labor economics and about the economics of education. What tasks can skilled people do better than computers? What are the critical human skills in economies that are filled with computers? Not obvious questions, economists have found. Also, we see the demography of America's children are changing. An increasing percentage of American children have demographic characteristics of children who historically have not fared very well in American schools. So we have a new set of questions, increasing data, partly the result of advances in computerization, advances in data storage, and improving research methods. So we have a real growth, again, in the economics of education. Okay, just to summarize, what has not changed? Well, there are these enduring questions that are just as important now as they were when Schultz and his colleagues tackled them 50 years ago. What does education really do? Got it. Second, how does education influence the well-being of individuals and societies? The answers may seem initially obvious, but the harder you think about them, at least in my mind, the less obvious the answers are. What's the most efficient ways to provide high-quality education? So those are really enduring questions, and of course economists have always believed that incentives matter. That's always, economists always look and study incentives. It's not changed. But what has changed? Last slide. First of all, I think in increasing recognition, it's really hard to get the incentives right. Whether you look at merit pay, whether you look at, for classroom teachers, whether you look at how do you get high school kids to pay attention to schoolwork. Turns out, yeah, incentives matter. But what are the right incentives? I think economists are much more sober and cautious now about how hard it is to get those right than they were, say, 20 years ago. I think an increasing recognition there are no silver bullets. Not only does providing more additional money is not a silver bullet, vouchers aren't, merit pay, neither are standards-based reforms. And a recognition that if you're asked what's the best way to improve education, is it vouchers, is it merit pay, the only sensible answer is I need to ask you about 20 questions about the details of what you have in mind. That broad-based, whether it's vouchers or standard-based reforms, doesn't provide any answers, because if you look, for example, the variation in standard-based reforms across states in the U.S. is enormous. So details really matter. Also, the recognition that if you're going to do good work on understanding whether it's standard-based reform in a particular state, whether it makes sense to hold children back in third grade if they don't pass exams, you need not only to have good quantitative data, you really need to have a very careful understanding of the institutions and of the behavior of the people who work and attend schools. Point here is qualitative research is not a substitute or an alternative to quantitative research. It's an inextricable complement if you really want to do good work. So last point, growing interest among economists in things other than how much people earn. For example, impacts on health, impacts on children of people who get education, impacts on civic participation. Those are new areas in economics, and as economists have studied those closely, they've come to understand a lot of the things they need to know to do that work well. They need to learn with people who have expertise in other areas, in other disciplines, expertise in practice. And frankly, that's why I love doing the economics of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Thanks. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't meet the stereotype of the Asian American computer whiz, so I'll just read from my notes. All right. Congratulations to Harvard Ed Review on the 75th anniversary. I'm very honored to be a part of this panel. I'm going to build on comments by Sonia about attacks on social justice and comments by Dick on no silver bullet to bring about change. And I'll do so by beginning with a story. I once taught a lesson to student teachers on multicultural education that focused on music. And I was trying to show that you can trouble the canon in music education by including music from different cultures. And in this case, I was including a song from my home state of Hawaii. I was trying to show that the teaching of different music provides the opportunity to teach about different cultures, right? When you want to give the cultural context to whatever song you're teaching, here's a chance to, in this case, teach about Hawaii and its culture. But I was also trying to show that what context you give influences the lesson, right? Different stories lead to different learnings. So if the context of your song is a story of Hawaii that's filled with foods and festivals, well, that's going to lead to very different kinds of learning than if the story was one of the monarchy and the overthrow and histories of colonialism and imperialism. And the contrast I like to give is, or the comparison is, sometimes let's say not everyone has a story, but let's say you're dating someone and you have your song. So every time that song comes up on the radio, you're like, right? Until you break up with that person, and then every time that song is on the radio, you're like, nah. Okay, so my point here is that different stories lead to different learnings. All stories are partial. There is no one best story, and there's also no one best way of teaching. Here's the irony of this lesson. I often ended my lessons by having people talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the very way I taught, because I was trying to show that different ways, every way of teaching has their strengths and weaknesses. I thought I had anticipated all of the weaknesses until one student said, well, I thought it was interesting the way you had us warm up, because I told them, this was an interactive music lesson, right? They had to sing with me, and we warmed up together. So I was telling them how to breathe and how to open their mouth. And he said, well, you kind of implied that that was the best way to sing, but different cultures sing very differently. There are many ways to use the body to produce music. You've kind of reinforced the privilege of that one way, and ironically, it's the way of singing that's used in the kind of music you're trying to trouble, the canon. So at the time I said, good point, and I moved on with the lesson. But my point here is that That, I would argue, is the kind of a learning moment that we want to see in classrooms, right? We don't want people to simply buy into my story of Hawaii or my way of thinking about anti-oppressive education. In other words, it's the gaps in our teaching that often provide the most powerful moments of anti-oppressive teaching and learning. The gaps in both what we teach and how we teach. So let me apply this to what and how we research. There are, of course, many frameworks for thinking about the past and the future of education research. I'm going to focus on this one framework of gaps and partiality as I look at 3 areas of concern: the research community, the research product, and the research question. So first, the research community. In the music lesson I just described, I should note that educators often respond to me when I tell them that story by saying it's really uncomfortable to put front and center the gaps in our own teaching. And similarly, I want to suggest that researchers often feel uncomfortable centering the gaps in their own research. Example would be many graduate students of color have come up to me and talk about feeling like they cannot talk about race, which is kind of ironic, but that's sort of the thing that they're wanting to do research on. And where are they feeling the silences from? Often their advisors, who identify as the leading scholars on issues of race and multicultural education and urban education. The irony is that these advisors often became the leaders of the field precisely by doing research that troubled the field before they came along, right? Higher ed places a value on those who define or lead the field, and I want to suggest that this places pressure on academics to stake out their own territory. In other words, a structure is put in place to make us feel quite invested in our status and our ideas, and thus to resist change. So what would it mean for the research community to center its own gaps in its work? What would it mean for mentors to value the troubling voices of emerging scholars? We're about to see a conversation take place in the education research community. A lot of the leading scholars and editors of journals have come together to say, let's have a written conversation about authorship. They're going to debate questions, we're going to debate questions of things like sole authorship versus co-authorship, publishing something that's admittedly in progress versus publishing something that's presumably final. And I want to suggest that these debates get at the notion of how research is necessarily partial. If this conversation gets us thinking more about authorship and research and leadership as things that are collaborative versus competitive, I think we'll be moving in important directions. So my point here, anti-oppressive educational research has moved more and more to developing new researchers in ways that center the gaps in our field, and I encourage more such movement in the future. This notion that research cannot help but to be partial leads to my second topic, which is the research product. The point of my story on the music lesson is that any story we tell is partial, right? It requires choices in its production, it sparks reaction in its telling. And similarly, any research product is going to be partial. It can only tell part of the story. It requires choices in how it's created and sparks reactions in how it's told. This insight is not new, right? Over 3 decades, researchers have argued that we need to present data in ways that do not purport to tell the whole story. That is, more and more researchers have moved away from presenting data, particularly qualitative data, as windows or as mere representations of reality, and more to data as texts, as admittedly partial texts that readers need to take up and use to raise questions that not even the researcher had yet raised. Examples include textual representations that take the form of poetry or parallel tracks or dramatizations or other genre or alternative uses of audio and visual senses that acknowledge that what is presented is only part of the story, and more importantly, that what is presented can mean more than what the researcher made of it. With advances in technology, I see even more debates over what makes for a research product. On the one hand, we see technology being used to give more quote-unquote real representations of voice. So examples include e-dissertations or e-books that incorporate video clips of interviews or classrooms. But I suggest that this is not the only use for technology, because as with critiques of cinema verite in the 1980s, we can critique these representations as somewhat insidious moves toward naturalism or realism, in that they mask the choices that are made to get to this partial representation. So in contrast, I also see technology being used in ways that I said poetry or drama is being used. Namely, they're being used to force the reader to take the text and read it in a way that looks beyond what even the researcher foretold. This imperative to view text as partial can be manifest in interactive CDs or interactive websites, which I think we'll see more universities come to accept as parts of dissertations. My point here is that anti-oppressive education research has moved more and more toward creating research products that center their own gaps, and I encourage more such movement in the future. My third point is on the research question, and let me begin with another story. When I was in graduate school, one of my graduate advisors once helped me see how every research question begins with assumptions. Right? The question of, let's say, why do Asian Americans do better in schools is based on the assumption that Asian Americans indeed are doing better in schools, right? The question of, in contrast, why does anti-Asian racism get overlooked in schools also begins with the assumption that there is anti-Asian racism and it's being overlooked in schools. Every question is already framed by certain assumptions and concepts. Well, this leads me to ask, what concepts might be framing or limiting our research in ways that we're not yet aware? I draw here on my current research on education policy that shows that the concepts put forth by, say, the Bush administration or the current Department of Education, concepts or frames like high standards, accountability, testing, sanctions, choice, are the same concepts that are framing the alternatives, right? So if you look at the proposals put out by Bush and you look at the alternatives put out by, let's say, the Gore and the Kerry campaigns in the last few presidential elections, many have argued that the details of their proposals are different, but the frames, the central concepts that I just named, are the same. What's significant here is that the alternatives, by not reframing the debate, operate quite insidiously. In fact, many initiatives to improve schools from both the right wing and the left wing are operating quite insidiously. So if we look, for example, from the left at initiatives to, quote, close the achievement gap or, quote, create safer schools, as well as initiatives from the right on funding, like the so-called 65% solution, or on teacher quality, such as ABCDE's so-called passport to teaching. Arguably, all of these initiatives have an assimilationist demand and or are linked to other initiatives from the right. Right, the 65% solution, this funding redistribution type of, or funding reallocation type of thing is connected, if you look at who's funding it and who's leading it, to initiatives on vouchers and initiatives on tax cuts, right? So this leads me to ask, what concepts, like scientifically valid, are currently framing educational research? And how do these frames make possible only certain questions? And what might alternative theories or texts or methods suggest to be anti-oppressive frames? Further, this leads me to ask, as in the Hawaiian music lesson, what would it mean to teach others and ourselves to currently search for the gaps in whatever frames we use, and perhaps more importantly, to including the frames that we are calling anti-oppressive frames, and how might we use the gaps as catalysts for change. So my point in this section is that anti-oppressive education research has moved more and more toward reframing, and perhaps more important, toward troubling any framing that we use, and I encourage more such movement in the future. These are the questions I urge us to ask as we engage in this, as we look to the future of education research, and I hope this presentation helps in this process. Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by asking the panelists if they'd like to comment on one another's presentations. Any reactions?
It's more fun to hear from the audience.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, I invite you to the microphones, and maybe I could get the panelists started off with a question of my own, which is, I now know a lot about what schools of education are criticized for. Since this year I've been serving as the acting dean. And education schools and education in general is sometimes criticized because there is no canon of education research. So my question for you is this a fair question? Should there be a canon of education research? Should this be something that the field is working on collectively or not? I have a feeling you have a thought about this, Kevin.
I don't know, do either of you want to go first? I'm not sure how to respond to that.
I'll just take a stab at it. I think that there's an implicit canon of educational research that the kinds of questions that are asked are not surprising in education, that there are particular texts that are, seen as the standards. And I would argue that it's important to shake it up a little bit. I don't think that we need a rigid canon of educational research, because whenever you have a canon, you have an assumption that everything is already finished. At least the field has been defined and can be further refined, but it's sort of there. And I think that is very troubling to me, because a lot of the questions that should come up then would never come up, because the world is always changing, the landscape is always changing, schools are always changing, teachers and children. And so those questions that have to do with all of those changes would not be asked, would not be part of that canon.
That's a hard question, Kathy. I think I'd say one reason I like being at the school is there are people who know much more about learning and teaching than I do, and I need to be able to talk to them to understand questions that I'm interested in, like, for example, whether it's how would merit pay for classroom teachers? Was that a good idea or a bad idea? Of course, it depends on the details of the plan, surely, but even then, you need to think about, well, what really matters to classroom teachers? What do they need to do a better job? I don't even have the language very well. So I want to understand, I think it's important for economists doing good work in education to understand teaching and learning. I also think it's important to understand child development and adult development, because I think that makes, and so for those, so I think that makes a lot of sense, and I always encourage the people who want to work with me to learn those things. That's why I like having a single doctoral program. Now, at the same time, I would say, however, that it is equally important that folks who want to study either teaching and learning or adult or child development ought to learn some social science, ought to learn something about scarce resources and incentives. I don't know whether others share that view or not. So I'd say there are different lenses with which to look at the problems all of us in a Appian way care about, because time is short and there's so much to learn, and to make a living in the world you have to specialize and have a niche and be good at something, and you can't be good at everything. But before you, in the process of getting good at something or some small collection of things, I think it is important to understand other parts of the terrain so you know what you don't know.
I kind of agree with Sonia in that, in some ways, I wonder if there is a canon, or at least some privileged texts and theories. And I say that because I think there are times in which it seems as though certain courses, we expect certain readings to be on them, or even the example I was giving earlier today, sometimes we get reviews from submissions to journals that say we're not in conversation with the field because we haven't cited the right people, or the main writers or the main texts. I think it's arguable whether or not there's a canon, but I also think, I would argue that there will always be, and it's never escapable, that there will always be privileged voices and texts in any context at any time. And the challenge is not to get rid of that as if everything is going to be created equal. I think the challenge is to get people to always have a critical eye and to be able always to ask the questions of, well, which voices are being privileged in this particular historical moment or cultural moment? Who is benefiting from this perspective, being the canon or being at the center? What impact does that have on the ways that we understand education? For an example would be in teacher preparation. One of the central bodies of work, I think, across the country that we see privileged in schools of education is research on educational psychology, right, child development. That's one of the most consistent things we see in teacher education programs. And I think, rightfully so, people have said that is important, but what is made possible and what is made impossible in the preparation of teachers when that body of research is considered the most foundational to teacher preparation?
Yes.
My name is Carlos Prasad, and for the last 30 years, I have been an educational researcher in organizational effectiveness as well as tested. Now, my question is directed to Murnane. I would like to introduce Murnane as exhibit number 1 as a study for the 21st century. That is, how do we deal with the metacognitive studies of understanding researchers and their biases? For example, he ends his presentation about essentially saying that there's only one kind of research, which is quantitative research, and qualitative research at best is to supplement but never control the understanding of education as a whole. That may be true, but that's your bias. And at least if you told me the basis of it, I could respect what you did, as opposed to push it on as if it is a fiat accompli. It is not. Furthermore, in the economics of education, a 21st century topic that you have omitted that really creates a school across the street is organizational behavior. All right? That has emerged largely out of economics and has taught us a lot about both the micro behavior and the macro behaviors of schools. That work is still unfinished, whether you do it by quantitative research or qualitative research, because we need to know, indeed, whether or not school organizations, no matter what your policy preferences, do work or don't work, and where it does work, and if it does work, and what controls the inputs in a strict economic sense and the cost of those inputs to get the outcomes that you want. So I'm fascinated to introduce the question of you as an exhibit and under ordinary metacognitive studies of the biases that shape your commission and omission and its effect on the control of policy. Another way of putting it is where you started and never really ended. T.W. Schultz. Now, I happen to have been a student of Schultz at Chicago. And if you really understand Taylor, he's really coming out of a body of economics about economic growth, coming out of the 50s and 60s and the Third World. And his basic contribution is about human capital in education and created by education as a whole. You would never believe Schultz contributed to that monumental concept and the implication of that monumental concept by education, listening to you this afternoon. So here I find your omission again on Schultz, and your special emphasis told me a lot about the likely policy preferences you would favor, and your lack of candor and disclosure of your preferences and biases for this method of policy as a whole. That's my 21st century to you and all my researchers.
Okay, no comment. Yes, would you like a microphone? Okay, then shout it out. But maybe we can have somebody, yes, thank you.
Well, this has, is this working? I think I can talk perfectly loud. This has to do with the gap in the text. Okay. My name is Jane Rowan, and I was on the review board in 1950.
The microphone is working now. Thank you.
I was in the review board in the 1950s, if anyone here can believe that. And so I think that this is very relevant from that perspective, because when we were on the board, and I just talked with someone out there who says it's still true, we thought that our experience on the board was one of the best parts of our education as graduate students. But we weren't in a classroom. And as I understand it, the topic today was moving scholars into classroom or something like that. And I sort of tried to monitor all 4 speeches, and they all seem to be assuming that education is equivalent to schooling. Now, we all know that that isn't so. I'm sure everyone in this room knows that isn't so. We will all give lip service to the fact that education is not equivalent to schooling, and yet when we start being operational about it, we all assume that it is. And the only research I heard talked about today assumed that. But in the 21st century, to think that most of what is educational or miseducational goes on in schools is really shocking. We all know that. Just look at the internet, look at technology, look at everything. So I would actually be interested to know not just what you think, but what the school thinks and what the review thinks about all the education and miseducation that's going on in the rest of society, not in schools.
Who would like to begin?
Well, I can't speak for either the review or for the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but just for our charge on this panel, which was to link research with schools. So I don't think that any of us assume that education only takes place in schools, but that's what we were asked to speak about.
But that in itself is what's so revealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I think it is an important question. It's not the only question to be asked, but I think that it is a relevant question of how scholars and schools can be more can be linked more. There are many other questions, as you suggest, that are also important, especially in the 21st century.
Would anybody on the HER board like to respond? Okay. Well, maybe that will happen. Yes.
Good evening. You're educational researchers, and so I guess, but this might be a presumption, that you plant yourself firmly in the field of being applied scientists. And I was wondering, what other applied sciences do you feel akin to? Medicine, clinical psychology, engineering? And how might that affect how you approach it? I would expect different answers to different panels.
Okay.
Sean, that's a thoughtful and interesting question. I don't think I have a great answer. I've been interested in the work Mike McPherson, who's now the president of the Spencer Foundation, which is the foundation that is the biggest supporter of educational research in this country. He, for a long time, was the co-editor of a journal that specialized in the intersections between economics and philosophy, and has written a book about that. It's a wonderful book because it reveals how an awful lot of the analyses that economists would call positive analyses, as if they have no kind of normative assumptions underlie them, in fact have lots of normative assumptions underlie them. It's quite a fabulous book. So I by no means have expertise in that, but that's one clear intersection. Another is with psychology. You may have seen Harvard Magazine. The last issue, I believe, talked about the behavioral economics, and Harvard's hired a whole bunch of them, people who are studying the ways in which human beings behave in ways that in older economic thought would have been called irrational. You know, it's Kahneman and Tversky, the Nobel Prize winners, kind of started that, and I think interesting enough, it comes from there's a guy named George Katona who wrote about economics and psychology in the 1960s. He was kind of, it looks like 4 decades before his time, but now there's an awful lot of, I think, openness by economists that they need to get beyond these assumptions that human beings are always rational, and recognize that they need to understand better how human beings actually behaved when placed in different situations. And often, the way situations are framed has a very big impact on how they behave. I think that's not news to psychologists. It's been news to economists.
Hi, my name is Heather Harding. I'm a doctoral candidate here and a former board member. I was curious about, I guess, both Dr. Nieto and Dr. Kumashiro's comments about new scholars and influences around how new researchers craft their agendas, and since I'm very close to entering somebody's market somewhere, I wanted to know, and I think this is building off of Professor Murnane's incentives question, what are the incentives for new researchers to focus on issues of social justice, to follow in the footsteps of innovators and leaders in the field, particularly, as you pointed out, Dr. Kumashiro, that there seems to be less room to make your mark. So, if we can't get the funding to do this kind of work because of the political agenda, then what are the incentives for us to go into the field and continue sort of the educator mantra that you can make a difference?
You take it.
Trying to play the quiet role and see how many questions I can avoid. No, I mean that's such a good question, because I think I was also having a conversation earlier today about, given all of the forces working against people from the margins sort of having voice in the academy, sometimes it feels like maybe it's so demoralizing, or there's so much that kind of comes to bear on our sense of self and our sense of purpose, that it might not be worth going into the academy. And the story that I gave in response was a chapter that I had read in a book by Mari Matsuda, where she talks about the importance of going around the country and giving lectures. And it's not so much the response that she gets about the content, although that is certainly significant because she is a groundbreaking scholar on critical race theory, but more so she talks about the responses she gets on a personal level by people who come up and say how meaningful it was to see her up there speaking on these issues. Her as a woman of color, her as an Asian American, her as just an incredibly progressive voice. And this was, 10, 15 years ago, at a time when that was such an unusual thing. And I was saying that that's part of what drives me right now to take every opportunity I can, partly because I like hearing myself talk, but also partly because I think it's important to get these different perspectives out, and just the political significance of being someone historically from the margins speaking out. And is there an incentive? I mean, I don't want to say it's all about out of the goodness of your heart, but I'm remembering this video that was about faculty of color that I saw with a group of graduate students of color back when I was in grad school, so this was maybe 10 years ago. And one of the things that we found most both disheartening and at the same time inspiring was a story of a black professor, woman, who said this was the sacrifice that she made. Like, she knew that going into the academy would have, at a time when there were no black women faculty at the university, would affect her social and personal life to such a degree that it could be considered a sacrifice to do that kind of work. And we thought, wow, that's incredibly sad. But what I think it did for us was give us a sense of a collective call to make that kind of a difference. It shouldn't all fall on the few faculty of color to make that kind of a change in the academy. I think the question of what incentive is there for faculty of color to do this work when there's so much working against us is not, and my point here is that that question should never be a question just for the faculty of color to answer. It's sort of like when I was interviewing for a job and people were saying, well, maybe he's not a good fit for this institution. And part of what my allies were saying is the question of whether or not I'm a good fit cannot be a question that reflects only on the faculty member, right? If I'm not a good fit, you have to be asking whether the institution itself should also be changing. And that, to me, is where everyone else needs to assume some responsibility for that.
I'll also respond to that question. I think it's a really important question, and I'll start by saying that we don't go into, I didn't go into this field because I would get a lot of benefit out of it, although I have gotten a great deal, and I'm very grateful for that. But I think I brought a lot also. I mean, I went into UMass 25 years ago, and I was one of 2 Latinos in the School of Education. And I just retired, and there is 1 left, So we haven't grown a great deal. And so it is difficult, although I think we also get a lot of benefit from it. But I find it incredibly heartening to do the kind of work that I do, because I have a passion about it, and so I think that that's really what needs to drive you, rather than thinking that there are incentives, because a lot of times there are not incentives. I mean, who went into multicultural education 25 years ago? Who did bilingual education all those years ago? I was a bilingual teacher before I became a doctoral student, and that was at the very dawn of bilingual education in 1968. You don't do it because there's a lot of benefit. And the other thing that I was going to say is that the assumption is that there are these scholars that it's sort of hard to get in, and I can assure you that it isn't. That those of us who are in multicultural education, for example, are really wanting young scholars, not only to take our place, because I don't think that that's what either they want or we want, but rather to shake things up and to question what we're doing, to forge new ideas and new directions for the field. So I would encourage you to think in that way instead, because there's a lot of room for growth.
Maria Levinson. I've been thinking about what the tone is here and what we're talking about. And it feels as though the tone is fairly reactive about somebody else's agenda out there, a research agenda or different conservative agendas or whatever. And it seems to me that one of the roles that the Harvard Graduate School of Education has always played was to help set the agenda, for what needs to happen with research, what needs to happen with schools. Now, I didn't always agree with the agenda. I mean, let's be real clear about this. But nonetheless, Harvard played a positive role, and I think we could say people in the movement also, who were not at Harvard Graduate School of Education, also have helped define it. And I guess my question to you, as here I am a practitioner, and now after 30 years of being a practitioner, now in higher ed, is how we can use research as well as practice in our roles as educational leaders to help frame a positive agenda of where people in the field, as well as people who are dealing with informal education, et cetera, what some of those questions are. And Dick, I think you were trying to deal with some of those big questions that are out there. But that's what I would like to hear from you, is where should we be going? And Dean McCarthy, you could also consider this question to you as well, in terms of thinking about some of those interfaces between research, practice, policy questions.
Do you want to start?
It's again a terrific question, and I think I think it's something we struggle with a lot as a professional school, in that we, I think, see our mission as bridging research and practice. We want to do the very best research that we can. Those of us who've chosen to spend a lot of our lives on Appian Way believe education, albeit broadly defined, is terribly important to people in every society. How do you, and there are some schools of education that have chosen simply to do scholarship and not to be connected to people in schools. That's not the choice our school has made, at least over the last 20 years anyway, and I can't really speak before that. And now you could argue, if you like that, being closer to schools, you can argue that's trying to make a difference to the people who are actually doing the work, the kids and those who are teaching them in the schools. Those who don't like that work say, well, that's getting, you're not stepping back far enough to tackle the big issues. I'm still here because I like that. But it's I guess I see it, I mean, it is a tricky balance. I mean, what that's been a challenge at every professional school. I mean, in a major research university, you want to do exemplary research, and the power is typically in the disciplines. You also want to make a difference.
I'm just going to add a little bit to what Dick was saying, because Dick and I, with some of our colleagues, have been working on some strategic planning initiatives for the school. Some of that has been prompted by thinking about the fact that this campus may move to Alston. So what do the next 5-10 years look like? And as Dick was saying, when we've looked at other schools of education, which will remain nameless, some really do focus more on the practice side. We're going to train practitioners. And there are several that really define themselves as more research-oriented. We're going to train education researchers. And actually, Harvard being Harvard, you could see how we might choose that, but we really haven't. I mean, what we've chosen is to really, we think, work at the nexus of research, policy, and practice. And I mean, I could embarrass Dick and talk about some of his work in the Boston Public Schools that led to this book, Data-Wise, that I spoke about when I introduced him. But and in fact, I wrote about this in the plan, because it's this beautiful example of how trying to help the Boston Public Schools deal with accountability data not only helped them, but led to changes in their policies and also provided an opportunity for student research projects. So if you sort of think about a model with arrows, that's what we really have, with the research feeding the practice, feeding the policy, and so on and so forth. In terms of thinking about the future, I have a couple things to say. One is, again, going back to this lens metaphor. I mean, we have people here who study education with the lens of the child, and in fact, I would fall into that camp as a developmentalist. That's how I was trained, and that's how I think about it. Other people have a wider lens where they're focusing on the classroom, or leadership, or policy, and I think we need all those people here. I think that the problems in education are so pressing that we need to have people looking at them from various perspectives. I also think, there are a lot of threats to schools of education because there are alternative efforts. There are venture philanthropists who are all kinds of people like this. And I think we need to embrace those people rather than feeling threatened by them, and to partner with them to the extent that we can. So I think in thinking about going forward, we've wondered, what can the business school teach us about management? What can the Kennedy School teach us about policy? And what can we teach them about instruction so that the child in the school are not black boxes? So those are just a few thoughts.
As a new doctoral student, I think we're really sort of indoctrinated into this idea that there's this sort of holy grail or this mystical quest to get published in really prestigious educational journals. That's kind of the beginning and the end of a researcher's, sort of quest. And that was really shocking to me, and I guess I was pretty naive, but I thought the quest was, higher student achievement and getting research into classrooms. And as it's coming out of the classroom, I can just about guarantee that teachers and principals and school board members are not reading the journals that everybody wants to get into. Education leadership from ASCD is probably the closest that the vast majority of teachers get to this research. So I guess my question is, to what degree are educational researchers responsible for pushing or facilitating the adoption of their research by classroom teachers, rather than people who are reading the journals? And then the second question is, to what degree does educational research sort of get marginalized when the tens of thousands of classroom teachers never see it, or at most see it in a story in the Boston Globe, rather than sort of internalize it into their classroom practice in a way that impacts student achievement?
I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, working at the national level, it's interesting to see how the big organizations and advocacy groups don't pay attention to, in large part, the journals as well. So it's not just the classroom practitioners. So who really are we speaking to? I mean, I think that's an important question to address. And I know I just made a broad statement about all national organizations, but I think the ones I've worked with, and there are a lot of them, have place value on research that comes in certain forms and from certain people. I mean, I don't think that's debatable, not from what I've seen. So I think we do need to think about the impact that we're trying to have, and I think one of the things we might want to think about is not just what is it that we're trying to say, but as you're suggesting, a criterion on sort of the value of a scholar has to also be who are we reaching and what impact that reach is having. Why, for example, is there no value put on taking the same ideas but publishing it in, let's say, an op-ed piece, which we know policymakers and the general public do look at, or more popular magazines. I mean, if we think about, for example, the success of the right in getting certain frames out there, it's about many channels, it's about repetition, it's about consistency. Where we're not hitting the many channels, we certainly don't have that kind of repetition. And I think that's one of the things we need to be thinking about, is getting research published in many different kinds of venues, rather than, as you said, speaking only to ourselves.
Yeah, I want to say something about that as well. I think that it's our responsibility to do so, actually. It's not just something that, we can do, but that we should do. I've tried to do that all along, and it's sometimes difficult, but because you don't get the same recognition. But, for example, writing something in Rethinking Schools, I think, is much more powerful than writing something in the Harvard Ed Review, which I love, but lots of teachers are going to be reading that, teachers and other practitioners, and so I think we have to make that kind of gesture as faculty. Right now, as I was coming over, I was going through the page proofs of a magazine called School Talk. I don't know how many of you know it. It's from NCTE. And the whole issue will be devoted to this book that I wrote with teachers. That feels great because I know that a lot of teachers are going to be reading that. So I think it is our responsibility to get those things out. At the same time, I was just reading today in Education Week that a lot of schools are, because of the research, are now changing their policy on the times that they open in the morning. Now, we've all seen that kind of research, right? So it does have an impact, even if not every teacher, every policymaker, not every principal reads it. But, everybody now has heard that kids do better when they don't go to school at 7 in the morning, when, they can go to school at 9 in the morning. And that's having an impact. So I think that we can't just dismiss the, educational journals as irrelevant, because I don't think that they are. I think that some of them can be, because they speak such a specialized jargon that it's only to a few others who speak like them. But in general, I would say that publishing in educational journals is not only good for our careers, but it's also good for the general public if we also make an attempt to get those ideas out there in other ways, as Kevin says.
Can I just add a couple of things? And my guess is at least one of our panelists won't agree with this, but the reason I try and get my colleagues' work in the best peer-reviewed journals that I can get in is that typically, with exceptions, the better the journal, the better the feedback I get, and it means typically I do as many as 8 or 9 iterations back and forth with the journal, but the final product is a lot better than what I initially said. So and the better the journal, the better that works. Now, it does not mean I finally get it published in as good a journal as I could get in, that anybody's going to pay attention to it. The idea that there is a media out there just waiting for good research is just clearly wrong. And so you really, and done this. I've written 2 books with a close friend, an economist at MIT, who really understands this. Frank Levy really thinks the media is important. Frank, for the first year after we published each book, I got at least 3 emails a week of where we stood on Amazon.com, which I've never looked at. But in any case, Frank understood the importance of op-eds, the importance of pieces in Phi Delta Kappa and educational leadership, back page of Education Week, the importance of giving talks, the importance of trying to get reporters to call you and talk. That's part of the work you have to do if you want your stuff to be. You got to do really good work, get the best you can, but then you really got to market it.
Can I say something too, even though I'm not a panelist? I think you're right to question the incentives within the academy for success, because it isn't always about impact. I think it's more about impact in professional schools than it is in arts and sciences. And I just want to give a concrete example of that from my career. I work with a research network where we study the effects of early child care. And maybe 3 summers ago, I got a call from the National Council of State Legislators to come to Colorado to their annual convention to give a talk. And I said yes, and I found out that 3 of my colleagues, all developmental psychologists, had been asked first, and they said no. So I asked one of them why she said no, and it's because it was going to take 3 days away from her research time during the summer. And I said yes because state legislators are the ones responsible for child care policy, not the federal government. And I knew if I went there, I would have direct access to them. Now, if I were still teaching in a psychology department, I might have made the same choice that my colleagues made. So I think what I want to say to you as a young scholar is that you're right about the incentives, but you get to craft the kind of career you want, and ultimately you will make those choices to spend a Sunday writing an op-ed, which I actually did last Sunday, submitted it to the Boston Globe yesterday, wish me luck. But you know, those are the kinds of things that you often do on your own time, but they're important.
Good evening. My name is Monica Zeno Martin. I'm a master's student here at the Ed School, and I'm hoping that you can help me understand perspectives on qualitative and quantitative research in education. Professor Murnane, you talked about the importance of having both qualitative and quantitative research present, particularly in trying to craft solutions for improving schools and needing to gain sort of a deeper understanding of the institution itself in order to really come up with a viable solution. So I'm wondering about this intersection between quantitative and qualitative methods, and for those who might be emphasizing quantitative research over qualitative, so not an integration. What then happens to the voice of social justice, voices of multiculturalism in the classroom? And if it's not being told by qualitative research, how is that story being told?
Well, clearly, I mean, what our methods ought to follow what the particular question is, and the best way, and I think for an awful lot of questions you do need both. I guess, and I have learned an awful lot from qualitative research that I've read. I've tried to do some myself. There are people who do it better than I do. But I think, in terms of quantitative, the fact that we see what the statistics are. For example, I learned recently I was on at a European meeting and learned that there in France, it is illegal to have information on earnings by race. As a result of which there's no information on how people who are non-white or French citizens, what they earn. In the United States we have that, and I think that has been important in helping us to at least understand the challenges that we face and that dimension of the inequality that we need to struggle with.
Okay, well, I can see that our time is up, but is there one more quick question?
It's more of a comment, and I just wanted from the board to embrace the comment that came earlier about education and learning that happens outside of schools. I think it's very interesting that question came from a pioneer in women's rights for the board. And I think that if you look at one of our recent issues, there's a story, an article called Youth Radio and the Pedagogy of Collegiality, which talks importantly about learning outside of schools. And so I think the board is thinking about this, and I'm glad that you trouble us to continue.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank the board of the Harvard Ed Review for organizing this wonderful event. Obviously, I want to thank the panelists, but thank you to all of you, too, for being here.